Marcus Thorne believes that removing my identity will bury his secrets. He has no idea that he has just handed me the brush to paint his downfall. The thought hits me like a cold, hard stone as I stand across the street from the gallery, the city's drizzle dampening my face. It's a typical Soho night, with neon lights bleeding onto wet pavement, creating a fractured rainbow. Inside, through the plate glass window, is another world. A silent movie about wealth and power. Men in $1,000 suits and women dressed in silk laugh quietly, their champagne flutes catching the light like small, captured stars. They gather around abstract canvases, nodding attentively as if the chaotic splashes of color are communicating with them in a language only they, the fortunate, understand. I used to be in that world. I used to be the translator. Now I'm just a ghost on the outside watching a party I wasn't really invited to. My reality, the real world, was quieter. It was the scent of ancient canvas and linseed oil, the soft scrape of a palette-let knife, and the quiet reverence of a library. My loft, a clean, orderly place with exposed brick walls, had seen more history than the majority of the guests at the party. My wealth wasn't in a bank account, it was in the floor-to-ceiling bookcases stuffed with art history tomes, the meticulous collection of pigments in small glass jars, and the quiet assurance that came from knowing my profession better than anybody else. It was a space founded on passion, not profit. How can you tell? Clue's voice, full with the eager inquiry of a 20-year-old, transports me back to a happier time. My world came crashing down in a matter of weeks. She was my intern, a brilliant spark from NYU who gazed at me with admiration that warmed and humbled me. We were in my studio, with the afternoon sun slanting through the enormous industrial window and illuminating the dust motes in the air. I was looking at an 18th century portrait, my gloved fingertips floating just above the surface. To me, it just looks old, she murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. I grinned without looking away from my loupe. Old is a story, not a state, I informed her. Look closer. Do you see the craquelure? The tiny cracks in the paint. I indicated with the tip of a delicate brush handle. They're uneven, chaotic, like a spider's web spun by a drunken arachnid. That's nature. A forger can bake a canvas to create cracks, but they can't replicate the randomness of 200 years of changing humidity, of seasons passing, of a house breathing. They create a pattern, a predictable shattering, but authentic age is Kho's theory in miniature. Art doesn't lie, Chloe. You just have to know its language. She leaned forward, her eyes wide, and I witnessed the moment when the jumble of cracks became a meaningful script for her. That was my bliss. Opening up that globe and sharing that language. My life was basic. My work was my identity. My reputation was my fortress, constructed brick by brick with each proper attribution, discovered fake, and subtle nod of recognition from museum curators and auction house experts. On my desk, next to a jar of well-sharpened pencils, was a framed portrait of my father and me. He was an artist, a smart man with sad eyes that I never quite understood. He showed me how to see the world rather than simply looking at it. He painted landscapes for himself rather than galleries. He told me that each brushstroke represents a confession. My stronghold was built upon his foundation, and I assumed it was invincible. The first fracture in that fortification occurred in an office that felt diametrically opposed to everything else in my life. Marcus Thorne's penthouse overlooked Central Park, providing a bird's eye perspective of the city. The air was pristine and precisely cold. The decor was deliberately minimalist, which means that each item was more expensive than my automobile. A Bernoucuvy sculpture sat on a pedestal where a regular person would place a lamp. A Rothko leaked its colors over a wall that could have held a family. It was a mausoleum of wealth, with art serving as an asset rather than a pleasure. Marcus Thorne was cut from the same pricey, chilly substance. He was 60, with a mane of silver hair so flawless it appeared sculpted. His clothing was reminiscent of Italian craftsmanship. Power washed over him in waves, but it was tempered by a veneer of charm so thick you could drown in it. Ems Chen, he said with a lovely, rich baritone. Your reputation precedes you, and they say you have the best eye in the business. He said, gesturing to a leather chair that was probably more expensive than my annual rent. It sighed when I sat down. I just listen to what the art tells me, Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice seeming small in the large, silent space. He smiled, a trained and dangerous thing. Then I have a symphony I need you to hear. He placed a heavy, leather-bound portfolio over the glass surface. The movement was quiet, beautiful, and final. Sunset over the Hudson, the long-lost masterpiece by Julian Dubois. It has surfaced, and I need you, and only you, to confirm its authenticity. My breath got locked in my throat. Julian Dubois, the enigmatic Hudson River schoolmaster, whose final painting was thought to be his greatest work, was lost to history due to a fire in the 1920s. Finding and verifying it was a career-defining opportunity. It represented the pinnacle of my vocation. The trust he placed in me, only you, was a potent combination. It felt like validation, a recognition of all my years of silent, meticulous effort. I saw the pinnacle of my career, an opportunity to associate my father's name, the name he had given me, with one of the century's greatest artistic breakthroughs. I was so concentrated on the summit that I never looked down. I had no idea I was standing on a trapdoor, and Marcus Thorne's hand was already on the lever. The days that followed were a haze of frenzied productivity. Thorne had arranged for the picture to be relocated to a high-security appraisal room at his facility. It was a sterile white cage, more laboratory than studio. But when they showed off the artwork, the space vanished. It was breathtaking. A symphony, precisely as he had promised. The light, the color, the raw emotional force. Dubois' soul was right there on the painting. My duty was to distinguish emotion from fact. I spent days under the microscope examining pigment samples. The chemical makeup was perfect, matching the specific minerals Dubois was known to have obtained from the Catskill Mountains. I used X-ray fluorescent scans to investigate the underlayers and discovered weak, ghostly remnants of a preparatory sketch that matched his recognized methodology. I evaluated the canvas, the weave of the Belgian linen, and compared it to bolts of fabric from his favored supplier. Everything screamed genuineness. Every test I performed and every fiber I inspected corroborated what my heart had previously told me. It was a superb forgery, not simply a painting, but history itself. Thorne submitted provenance documents that were a textbook in deception. Photographs of the picture at a Gilded Age home are faded and sepia-toned. Letters bearing brittle wax seals from prior, fake owners. The beautifully preserved diary of a collector chronicling his purchase of the artwork in 1910. Each document was a piece of art in its own right, a strand in a web of lies so sophisticated and compelling that doubting them seemed like treason. I, with the best eye in the business, saw only what I was supposed to see. I saw a masterpiece and wrote my name on it, sealing my fate with a flourish of ink. The Christie's auction night was the mountain's pinnacle. The air in the great hall was filled with excitement and the aroma of expensive perfume. The world's wealthiest collectors were there, their expressions a mix of avarice and devotion. I sat in the first row as a guest of honor with Marcus Thorne. When they brought Sunset over the Hudson on stage, the audience let out a collective gasp. It shone under the lights, a diamond of unimaginable beauty. The bidding was a machine gun volley of numbers, a fight of egos contested in million-dollar increments. I felt a dizzying sensation of pride and ownership. My name and experience served as the foundation for the entire show. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel sounded like a gunshot. For $150 million to Mr. Marcus Thorne. The room erupted with applause. Thorne, the gracious victor, rose and gave a small bow to the audience. He was buying back his own painting, which is a standard way to boost an artist's market value. But no one noticed. He was the world's king. He turned to me and gripped my hand in a hard, chilly grip. "You've made me a very happy man, Miss Chen," he said, quietly, his dazzling grin never reaching his cold, calculating gaze. In that moment, I felt on top of the world. I was the kingmaker. I had no idea I was only the jester in his court, and my role in the play had ended. The collapse occurred so quickly that I didn't have time to yell. It all began with a news alert on my phone 2 days later. A headline in a French art journal. I recall the weird juxtaposition of it all. I was at a small coffee shop, with the aroma of roasted beans in the air and a half-eaten croissant on my plate, and my world was spinning off its axis. Dr. Arnaud Dubois, the artist's great-grandson, and an accomplished art historian in his own right, acclaimed the picture was a forgery. I laughed at first. A nasty and contemptuous tiny sound, an envious relative, and a publicity seeker. But then I followed the link. There he appeared on video, a serious-looking man with piercing eyes clutching high-resolution microscopic photos. This is a sophisticated deception. he explained in badly accented English. The brushwork is nearly identical, the pigments are correct. But my great-grandfather had a unique quirk, a signature. He always mixed a minuscule amount of pulverized quartz into his white paint, a specific type from a quarry near his home. He said it made the light sing. This painting has no song. He was holding up a report on spectral analysis. There is no quartz. A cold, steely dread invaded my veins. It could not be. I'd run the tests, but I had not tested for quartz. Why should I? It was a cryptic, almost mythical detail, a family secret. It was not mentioned in any official publication. Thorne's provenance file was so perfect and detailed that it constructed a narrative that left no room for question. It was intended to bring me, or anyone, to one unavoidable conclusion. Then the floodgates opened. The narrative was everywhere. My visage was on the screen, a professional photo from my website that appeared serious and competent. It seemed like a parody. Anti largest art scandal of TDKD. Srastis Sevidoviro 1504 Giri. Up Yapraisar Avicina Nasiuzid of Degrass negligency, possibly complicity. The worst thing was the press conference. Marcus Thorne stood at a platform, his face a mask of dignity and sadness. He played the role of the bereaved victim to perfection. I am as shocked and appalled as anyone, he added, his voice shaking with artificial passion. I put my complete and utter faith in the expertise of Miss Chen. It is a tragedy for the art world that this faith was so profoundly betrayed. He glanced directly into the camera, and for a brief moment, I thought he was staring at me, sitting numbly on my couch. His demeanor was one of pain, but his eyes were cold. Cold, triumphant ice. And I knew I wasn't mistaken. I'd been used. I was the patsy, the competent expert whose impeccable reputation was the final, critical component required to legitimate a fraud. He bought it himself to control the narrative, and now he was acting as the victim in order to sue the auction company and most likely collect on the insurance. He would profit from every aspect of the hoax, whereas I, the scapegoat, would be professionally crucified. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters. My email inbox was flooded with hostility. An official-looking email arrived, making my blood run cold. Notici ova medida suspension of your uprisars licenesi. My castle had fallen to rubble. My lawyer, a fine man who I couldn't really afford, lay it all out for me in his stuffy, book-filled office. He stared at me with pity, which was even worse than scorn. Ava, it's a slaughter, he remarked, rubbing his sleepy eyes. They have your signature on the certificate of authenticity. Thorne's legal team has a dozen so-called experts lined up, ready to testify that you were either grossly negligent for missing the quartz detail, or, more likely, that you were a willing accomplice who took a bribe. They'll bury us in motions and legal fees before we even see a courtroom. We can't win. He's too powerful. The system is designed to protect men like him. He was correct. Justice was not blind. It was simply looking the other way, its hand greased by Thorne's millions. I was wrecked. My name was poisonous. My life's work, my passion, and the entire essence of my identity had been taken from me and turned into a weapon against me. I was at the bottom of a vast chasm, unable to see the sky. The weeks that followed were spent in a gray, featureless landscape of sadness. I had to sell my loft, the sanctuary I had created for myself. I watched as people took away my furniture, equipment, and books. Each item they stole seemed like a portion of my soul was being auctioned. I moved into a small, run-down apartment in an area of town that reeked of damp concrete and rubbish. I was alone. The colleagues who had previously praised me have now crossed the street to avoid me. Chloe probably sent one tearful, confused email before telling her parents to stay away from me. I could not blame them. I was an illness. For days, I did nothing but sit on the barren floor of my empty new apartment, surrounded by the few boxes I still had. The only thing I hung on the wall was my father's little, plain landscape picture. The scene was simple, a field with a line of trees in the distance. It was not his best work, but it was my personal favorite. I stared at it for several hours, my head a dismal echo chamber of failure and guilt. I gazed at the photograph of him that I had preserved at his sad, knowing gaze. He had been defrauded by galleries his entire life, with his skill being disregarded in favor of artists who were better at promoting themselves. He died with his genius largely unacknowledged, a humble artist who poured his passion into canvases that primarily gathered dust. I had hoped that my accomplishment would rehabilitate his legacy, demonstrating that a Chen could dominate the art world only on merit. And I'd failed him. Then, one night, driven by cheap whiskey and self-loathing, something changed. My gaze shifted from his portrait to the painting on the wall. My eyes, trained by years of compulsive study, immediately began to disassemble it. The composition, brushwork, and use of color. Then I saw it. It was a minor detail that no one would notice unless they looked for it. There was a single, out-of-place speck of white paint on the tallest tree's uppermost leaf. A dot. It wasn't a highlight, and it didn't make artistic sense. It was just there. I instantly remembered him doing it a fast, final swipe of the brush. He referred to it as signing off. It was a tiny, secret signature, a little mark of ownership concealed in plain sight. In that moment, a vivid remembrance of the Dubois forgery flooded back to me. There was a similar mark. A single, small spot of white paint had been on the edge of a rock in the front, almost completely obscured by shadows. It was in an unlikely location for a highlight. At the time, I dismissed it as a stray fleck, a minor studio accident. It wasn't Dubois' style at all. However, it was in my father's manner. The whiskey glass dropped from my grasp and shattered on the floor, but I didn't notice. It was not a mistake. It was a message, a signature. The forger, whomever he was, had either been trained by my father or studied his work with a microscope-like focus. And in this multi-million-dollar counterfeit, he had left a tiny, desperate trail, a signature that only one person on the planet could ever recognize. A scream for aid is hidden in plain sight. The sadness, shame, and despair did not go away in that moment. It had a chemical reaction. It crystallized. It turned into ice in my veins. The self-pity burned away, leaving only a cold, hard, diamond-sharp clarity. Marcus Thorne had not only destroyed me, he exploited my father's legacy, the delicate tactics he had passed down, to do this. This was more than simply an attack on my profession. It was a violation of my soul. I knew what I needed to do. I was not going to sue him. I was not going to clear my name in the courts that he controlled. I was going to shatter his world the same way he had mining from the inside out, with the very thing he loved as the weapon. The first thing I did was cut my hair. I stood in front of the shattered bathroom mirror, mesmerized as long black strands dropped into the sink. It was a severing of the old me, the trusting, naive Chen. The woman looking back at me in the mirror was different. Her eyes were colder and her jaw set. The scholar was gone. A predator was peering back. I sold my final expensive items, including a rare first edition art history book given to me by my father. It stung, but sentiment was a luxury I couldn't afford. I took the cash and went hunting, not in the brightly lighted galleries of Manhattan, but in the darkly lit taverns and back alley warehouses of Brooklyn and the Bronx. The opposite side of the art world. The underbelly, where provenance was a filthy word and a masterpiece was only worth what you could sell it for. My previous name was worthless, but my education was valuable. I started tiny. I'd sit at a bar for hours, nursing a single beer and listening. I overheard a low-level smuggler brag about a shipment of Ming period pottery he was transporting. The following day, I contacted him. I informed him that his pottery was a forgery from the late 19th century, and I explained how to verify it by examining the chemical composition of the cobalt blue glaze. He was outraged, doubtful, and amazed. He lost money on the transaction, but I spared him from federal charges. In exchange, he offered me a name. That name was followed by another. I became a ghost, a tale in the making. They dubbed me the Whisper. I didn't buy or sell anything. I dealt in a much more valuable commodity truth. I could recognize a forgery from across the room. I could tell you which South American organization used folk art to launder drug money, or which Russian tycoon concealed his assets in impressionist paintings. I freely shared my intelligence, establishing a network of informants and debtors who owed me. I wasn't one of them, but I was helpful to them, and in their world, useful meant safe. My search eventually took me to a dirty, huge warehouse in Red Hook. The air smelled of turpentine and decay. I discovered Silas there, surrounded by half-finished canvases and sculptures in various stages of fake production. He was an elderly guy with hands smeared with a kaleidoscope of colors and eyes that had witnessed every trick and swindle the art world has to offer. He was a skilled forger, a failed artist who discovered his genius through mimicking. And while we talked, I found the connection I was seeking for. He was a young, struggling artist decades ago, and my father served as his mentor. Your old man was a purist, Silas replied, his voice hoarse. A true artist. He taught me everything. How to mix pigments, how to prep a canvas, how to make the brush tell a story. He also taught me that little trick with the white dot. Our secret handshake. I showed him an image of the fake Dubus. He looked at it for a long time. Yeah, that's my work, he responded quietly. Thorne commissioned it. Paid me a fortune. He said it was for a private client, a prank on another collector. I didn't know what he was going to do to you with it. I had no ill will towards Silas. He was just another pawn like me. Thorne has a weakness. I murmured softly and evenly. I've been studying him. He uses art to launder money from his dirty real estate deals. He buys a legitimate piece with dirty money, then sells it at a public auction, often to one of his own shell companies, for a hugely inflated price. The money comes back looking clean, with a Christie's receipt to prove it. But his real weakness, the one that overrides his business sense, is his ego. He's obsessed with completing his Julian Dubois collection. He believes he owns. Silas stared at me with a flash of recognition in his exhausted eyes. So you want to create a bait? Another forgery? I shake my head. No, I want to create a masterpiece. A red herring, as the spies would say. A painting that never officially existed, a lost study for his most famous work, The Final Muse. We're going to create a painting so perfect, so irresistible to his ego that he'll bleed money to get it. But this one will have a secret of its own. I spent the next 2 months in the warehouse with Silas. We were a two-person conspiracy, powered by coffee and a common yearning for poetic justice. Silas was the hands, while I was the architect. I made a 19th century canvas from a useless painting I found at a flea sale, painstakingly peeling off the old paint. Silas combined the pigments and aged them using chemical alchemy until they were spectrally identical to Dubois' palette. He even reproduced the quartz, laced white paint using stone samples I had obtained from the actual quarry near Dubois' former home. He painted with a mastery that was both stunning and tragic. He channeled the deceased artist, stroke by stroke. My contribution was a secret. I had Silas paint another picture, a ghost in the machine, underneath the first layer of oil paint. He used a unique, thermochromic paint that I developed with the assistance of a dissatisfied chemist who owed me a favor. It was a complicated polymer floating in an oily foundation. At room temperature, it was absolutely translucent and undetectable. However, when exposed to a specific, prolonged heat, for example, the heat from bright display lights at a big auction house, the polymers realign, and the paint turns a striking, impenetrable black color. The hidden image was not a painting. It was a ledger. Account numbers for Thorne's offshore havens in the Cayman Islands. Names of his shell companies. A thorough flowchart of his complete money laundering enterprise. Over the previous year, my network of underworld friends had assisted me in gathering every piece of incriminating evidence. The last touch was the frame. I hired a skilled woodworker who specialized in constructing imitation antiques for movie sets to make it for us. It was an accurate period recreation. But I had him hollow out a small, insulated compartment in the back, just big enough to fit a tiny, battery-powered radio receiver and a modest heating element woven into the canvas stretcher. It was all controlled by a small, unobtrusive remote trigger the size of a car key fob. We were making a Trojan horse, and Marcus Thorne planned to personally wheel it through the gates of his own citadel. The scene was set for Sotheby's annual charity gala, the most important event on the New York social calendar. Getting our work, now called The Final Muse, into the auction was surprisingly simple. I used one of my contacts to fabricate a faultless, albeit entirely fictitious, pedigree dating it back to the house of a secluded European nobleman. The news of a newly unearthed Dubois masterpiece traveled quickly throughout the art world. Sotheby's, hungry for the contract and the reputation following the Christie's disaster, didn't hesitate. The bait was in the water. I was invisible on the night of the auction. I gotten a job with the catering firm, my face disguised behind a generic black uniform and my hair tucked under a cap. I walked among the sparkling masses, a ghost in plain sight, my heart pounding against my ribs. My fingers drew a worried pattern around the small remote trigger in my pocket. There he was, Marcus Thorne. I was seated in the front row, same like before. He exuded confidence, his gaze fixated on the painting displayed on stage. It was beautiful. Silas had surpassed himself. It was a masterpiece of deception, and it was singing its siren song directly to Thorne's vanity. He had to have it. It was the missing item in his collection, the one that would solidify his legend. The bidding began, and it was fierce. But I knew no one else had a chance. Thorne was a shark who could smell blood. He dispatched his rivals with harsh, multi-million-dollar bid increases, his jaw set in a determined expression. Sold! The gavel dropped. For an unprecedented $210 million to Mr. Marcus Thorne. A wave of applause swept across the room. My fingers curled on the trigger in my pocket. This was it. Thorne, delighted, ascended the stage to accept his trophy. He stood near the painting, basking in the spotlight and the admiration of the audience. He seized the microphone and delivered a victory speech. Tonight, he started. We not only support a noble cause, but we celebrate the enduring power and beauty of art. He never got to complete the sentence. I pressed the button from behind the curtain in the back of the room. The shift began on stage, under the searing glare of the spotlights. It began slowly with a gentle darkening, like a cloud passing over the sun. A few people in the front row mumbled in confusion. Then the transition accelerated. The beautiful, ethereal colors on the muse's face started to curdle and vanish. The exquisite brushstrokes that defined her garment faded into muddy shadows, and suddenly the secret layer appeared. Stark, black lines began to crawl over the painting, resolving into terrifying clarity. A Swiss bank account number emerged on the muse's forehead. The names of shell corporations trickled down her arm. A sophisticated web of arrows and boxes, a perfect representation of his illegal organization, blossomed over the peaceful scenery in the background. The masterwork had become a confession. A profound quiet descended upon the huge hall. The hush was so intense that it felt as if the air had been drained from the room. Then followed the gasps, whispers, and frenetic flashes of 100 cell phone cameras. The art had lied, and now it was revealing a dreadful, unmistakable truth. I observed Thorne. His expression was a slow-motion car wreck of anguish. Smug joy quickly gave way to confusion. The confusion transformed into disbelief. His incredulity turned to nauseating horror as he recognized the numbers and identities. His empire and secrets were exposed to the entire world on a $200 million canvas. The fear gave way to sheer, ineffective wrath. His breath came in frantic spurts, and a sheen of sweat immediately appeared on his brow. His furious, terrified gaze scoured the crowd, searching for the architect of his downfall. Then he found me. I had removed my catering jacket and cap and was standing calmly near the exit wearing a basic black dress. I was not smiling. I was not gloating. I simply met his eyes, my face as icy and definitive as a judge's decision. He knew in that single, piercing glance. He witnessed it along the setup, the treachery, and the subtle, pathetic justice of it all. His face distorted into an expression of hatred and terror. He raised a shaky finger to point at me and opened his mouth to yell, but nothing came out. He was too late. On cue, the ballroom doors opened, and the room was swamped with FBI agents, their dark suits standing out against the evening gowns and tuxedos. Marcus Thorne. A lead agent declared, his voice echoing through the hushed chamber. You are under arrest for fraud and money laundering. As they tightened the handcuffs around his wrists, his gaze never left mine. It was the expression of a caged animal, a monarch who had just witnessed his entire kingdom burn to the ground before understanding the torch had been lighted by the ghost he thought he had created. The aftermath was a media frenzy. The Crimson Canvas, as the press called it, was the first piece of evidence in a case that took down not just Thorne, but also dozens of his co-conspirators. The art world was forced to undergo a painful period of self-reflection, with its sparkling mask ripped away to reveal the rot underneath. Marcus Thorne, now a thin, withered old man in a jail jumpsuit, has been condemned to decades behind bars. He'd die in a cage, a fitting conclusion for a guy who gathered lovely things and stored them away. Sometime thereafter, I learned that the Metropolitan Museum of Art had received a large anonymous donation. It was the complete, laundered $210 million from the auction, channeled back through a dozen nonprofit accounts I had established. The money was utilized to create a new fund in my father's name that will encourage great but underappreciated artists. His legacy was finally secured. My license was reinstated. Obviously, the case against me was withdrawn. But the Whisper disappeared as fast as she emerged. The FBI, led by a bright detective from the art crime team named Jake, had suspicions about her identity. but no proof. My underground contacts had closed ranks, and the trail had gone dead. Jake discovered me many months later. I was in my father's old studio, a dusty, light-filled place that I had successfully repurchased. I was fixing one of his old paintings, and the fragrance of turpentine and oil paint felt like a homecoming. The FBI can't find any evidence linking you to the auction, he stated, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't sound accusatory, just exhausted and little amused. The whisper seems to have vanished. It's a clean slate, Ava. I did not turn around. I just kept my hand steady and carefully applied a small amount of solvent to the aging varnish. I never wanted revenge, detective. I answered quietly but clearly. I wanted justice. Sometimes, you just have to frame it yourself. He was silent for a long time. I could feel his gaze on my back. Well, he finally answered, his voice tinged with a smile. It was a masterpiece. He turned to leave, carefully closing the door behind him. I set down my brush and strolled to the window, gazing out at the city. My city, I'd won. I got my name and my life back. But the journey had transformed me. The naive academic who believed art never lied was gone for good. I now understood that art could be used to lie, cheat, and destroy. But I also understood it might be used to reveal the truth in the most dramatic way possible. The innocence had vanished, replaced by a harsher, colder wisdom. It was a bittersweet victory. They say that revenge is best served cold. I was committed to exposing the truth, regardless of the consequences.